Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I recently returned from a lovely couple of weeks adventuring in Massachusetts, and I want to share some of what I saw and did while I was there. Not everything I did was bookish, but a great deal of my adventuring revolved around the literary movement Transcendentalism that grew in New England during the 19th century, which came to shape American literature and culture much more broadly, in profound ways, at least in the northern part of the country. We'll get into Transcendentalism a bit more over the course of what I think will be a handful of videos about my trip. During my 2 weeks of travel, I investigated several of the places where famous Massachusetts writers called home. And while I did, I read books both by and about those authors. But I also had a very different kind of bookish adventure, meeting up with a few booktubers, one of whom I've met up with every time I've been to Boston over the past 5 years or so, and also two other great booktubers I'd not met in person before. More on all that coming up later. I also went to bookstores all over the state, including some really great ones, and I'll try to share a little footage with you over the next few videos. Although it's now the month of May, I started my trip in April, and I had connected myself to two April Booktube events. One was People April, and I marked it by thinking about New England authors and reading not only their personal essays and journals, etc., but also biographies of those writers. Some of the reading had very close matches for the event's prompts, too. The other Booktube event I participated in was April Adventures. Obviously, I went on a literal adventure traveling through Massachusetts, and some of the writers I was exploring while I was in the state were themselves having either literal or intellectual adventures. I also had the adventure of going to a completely new kind of bookshop, a comic book shop. And in fact, I went to 6 different comics shops during my time in Massachusetts. And on top of that, I also had a bit of a silly little literary adventure involving authors whose hometowns I was visiting, where the authors star as characters in modern novels about them. Something I'll start explaining a bit more later in this video. So let's start at the beginning of my adventure. Although I usually fly up to Boston, this time I took the train. And when I was making my arrangements for the trip, issues with congressional funding meant that airlines were dealing with staffing complications for air traffic controllers and TSA workers. By the time I actually traveled, the increasing cost of jet fuel was creating a whole new set of problems for flights, with several being canceled at the last minute. So I scheduled my trip by train, a much longer journey than by airplane, but also quite a bit easier and quite comfortable. I boarded my train in Washington right after my first cup of morning coffee, and I did some reading on the train. And when I started getting a bit motion sick, I listened to audiobooks while doing a little knitting, or just looking out the windows at the changing scenery. Going north from DC into New England was like going back in time. Back only a couple of weeks, where trees that were past their bloom in the DC area were here just starting to emerge in their full glory in New England. My spring allergies also re-emerged as we entered the state. Also, there was a different set of trees and other plants too in this much more northerly ecosystem. I decided to take a train that went not straight to Boston, but instead went a bit further west into Massachusetts, to near the small town of Amherst, the home of one of the poets who was meant the most to me for all but the first decade of my life, Emily Dickinson. As we got relatively close to Amherst, the train started passing industrial mills lined up along the waterways. It made me think of one of my favorite Dickinson poems, a short one that uses these mills and waterways in its imagery. I sat on the train struggling to remember the exact words, something that used to be a talent of mine but is no longer. Eventually, I had to look up the poem. Let me read it to you. The brain within its groove runs evenly and true, but let a splinter swerve. 'Twere easier for you to put a current back when floods have slit the hills and scooped a turnpike for themselves and trodden out the mills. Here, Dickinson seems to be talking about how the smallest little change in perception can shift our entire mental landscape in ways we might not expect, and even shift it in violent ways. And she's using changes in the physical landscape to describe the emotional process. Quite often, Dickinson's readers point out her use of tightly compressed lines and a lot of what is called slant rhyme. Slant was a word that Dickinson used often in various contexts, and slant rhymes are the same thing as off rhymes. In this poem, we have groove and swerve, for example. There are dashes everywhere here, carrying different resonances at different times. In line 2, the dashes give a replication of the regular rhythm of thinking as it goes along its expected groove. The rhythm felt to me like the rhythm of the train I was riding at that moment, although Dickinson might have been thinking about the groove of mechanical devices in the mills, or perhaps just the train of her own thoughts. Then in the next line, the dash does something entirely different. After the splinter swerves, the dash gives us this moment of separation between the first path and the utterly different one created by the splinter. The dash isn't setting the rhythm anymore, but it's calling attention to its disruption or its breakage. This kind of analysis of form is always fun, of course, but I think I'm more drawn to what Dickinson was experiencing, what she might have been thinking or feeling, perhaps, as she wrote. If we look at the historical changes happening at the time, we could imagine that the splinter could be the massive social and economic shifts that came along with industrialization and urbanization in 19th century New England. At least to me, this feels like a more personal poem, though, an interior kind of poem, as most of Dickinson's work feels. Reading today's world, we might think about a poet talking about the impact of emotional trauma or something, or perhaps that a poet might be thinking about sensory sensitivities that some people suggest Emily Dickinson experienced regularly herself, leading to her withdrawal from at least a certain part of society. I sometimes imagine that this poem is Dickinson's acknowledgement that great minds should, as poets in a later period said, quote, make it new. And the transcendentalists themselves often talked about the newness they lived in. Just a little splinter of an idea can completely change the literary landscape. Certainly in her own poetry, Dickinson's unconventional choices made her work seem new to people. I'll come back to that idea and the use of the word new in transcendentalist circles in an upcoming video. I spent a few minutes thinking about that poem as we rode past the mills. Then soon the train pulled into the station closest to Amherst, and I took a lift, a car service more or less like a taxi cab if you're unfamiliar, to a beautiful little bed and breakfast, the Amherst Inn, right across the street from the Emily Dickinson Museum property. I chose this particular bed and breakfast just because of its convenient location, without having any idea how stunning a house it was. Let me show you around a bit. After I checked in and dropped off my bag, I had a cup of tea from the little tea service set up for guests, and then went out for a walk around town as the sun was starting to set. The town bookstore was a great little stop. Despite its small size, I loved how much locally relevant material was on the shelves. The staff members were setting up for an evening presentation that I wasn't interested in attending, so I soon exited. And eventually, I found myself at the archives. Now, those of you who know that I trained as an historian might not be surprised by the idea that I went to the archives in this historical town. But this particular one, it's not a library. It's a speakeasy. Here's the entrance. I had a cocktail, my first in a very long time, a martini with pear and almond, as well as blue cheese, called a soft touch. For a casual dinner, an appetizer of kimchi cheese dip on crackers. I pulled out my Kindle and started reading a book that was forthcoming that I think is out now by Bruce Nichols called Emerson's Circle, the Concord radicals who reinvented the world. Despite its very lively and energetic opening, I had to put it aside. As I said, I drink very little in this point in my life, and I'm afraid even one cocktail made it hard for me to concentrate on the argument of what is really a serious book, no matter how readable. When I returned to my bed and breakfast, I made myself a cup of tea and pulled out a book just for fun. An Emily Dickinson mystery. They're actually two completely different series of Emily Dickinson mysteries written by two different authors. The one I started that night was the first in Amanda Flower's series, entitled Because I Could Not Stop for Death, named after one of Dickinson's most famous lines. And I'll talk about the book in a bit more detail later in the video. Speaking of tea, though, let me show you the mug I'm drinking from right now before I tell you more about the book. It's an Emily Dickinson mug. In the autumn, several of you were incredibly kind and generous and sent me a huge assortment of literary mugs featuring the quote mugs of many of my favorite authors or the covers of their books. And as more and more of these mugs appeared on my doorstep, I decided to search for teas that would be perfect for the mugs. And I bought myself samples of way too many different kinds of teas from a variety of tea houses, which I'll be sharing with you occasionally over the next few months. Today's special Emily Dickinson tea is from the company Simpson and Vale. It's a jasmine tea with rose petals. And that's delicious. It's really gentle and fragrant. It's a perfect choice for Emily Dickinson. I think it would be better with sugar. I drink my tea without sugar in general, but teas with rose often really appreciate being sweetened. I have several more literary teas from Simpson and Vale, so you'll be seeing them again soon. Okay, after my tea and mystery reading, I had a lovely long night's sleep, and when I awoke, I shared breakfast with some other guests and the owners of the B&B, as well as with the company of their very friendly dog. After putting on my shoes and sweater, I headed across the street to the Emily Dickinson property. I keep calling it property instead of house because it's actually two houses, as well as a long path in between. First, there's the house where Emily lived during her adulthood, along with her family. And at the other end of the walking path is the house where Emily's brother lived with his wife, who was Emily's close friend. Both houses are available to tour, and the differences between the two houses are really fascinating. First, I took a tour through the house Emily lived in for the majority of her life. The guide was exceptional, quite knowledgeable, and also a great communicator, speaking to the audience that included several people who were clearly already quite knowledgeable themselves, as well as a fair number of folks who seemed fairly new to the life and work of Dickinson. She took us through the rooms that had been restored to appear as they would have looked in Dickinson's day. Quite a bit of the furniture, etc., is original, which I'll come back to in a minute, but some of it isn't. The reason is because the house had been sold. The kitchen that the Dickinson family used had been updated a couple of times in the early and then the mid-1900s, if I'm remembering correctly. Eventually it was sold to Amherst College, who even used it as faculty housing for a while. I didn't ask if literature teachers had first dibs on Emily's bedroom. Only about half the house is restored. Forensic architects, a term I had not heard before, helped the Emily Dickinson Museum figure out how the house was structured as much as they could, and they were still working on much of the rest of the house. When fragments of wallpaper, for example, were found, the museum reconstructed the pattern and created new identical wallpaper to hang in the same locations. Some of the most iconic items in the house are not original. In other words, not only the wallpaper in Emily Dickinson's bedroom, but also the dress she was known to wear regularly, this white house dress, or, quote, wrapper. I think, is how informal it is. I used to think of her white dress as lacy and ethereal, but it doesn't look that way in person. It's actually quite simple. Made from basic cotton, it's the kind of dress that women at the time wore to go about their daily household chores, partly because it was easy to clean using bleach. It absolutely was not the elaborate dresses that other Amherst women of her social class would have worn in public, even though Emily often did exactly that when company came to call. This was not her only dress. We know from her correspondence that she had calico dresses and the like as well. This version of the dress is just a copy. The real version is on display at the Amherst Historical Society in town. I took this picture in her bedroom, and you can see her tiny little desk here too, where she penned her poems. You can also see the two photographs of authors that Emily admired, George Eliot and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The family owned about 3,000 books in total, if I'm remembering correctly. Emily read very widely. Often her father did not approve of her reading choices and thought they might be harmful to her, but nevertheless he acquired copies of those books that she asked for. One of Emily's most famous lines is, "There is no frigate like a book," so we can assume she felt transported by her reading. Interestingly, a lot of the Dickinson's books were donated to one of Harvard's libraries and another set to Brown University, but there has been a campaign over the last many years to, quote, replenish the shelves. That is, to find other copies of the exact books and editions that had been on the shelves originally. Emily had two siblings, a sister who never married, just as Emily never married, as well as a brother. He did marry a woman named Susan Huntington, who was close friends with Emily as well. In order to hold the family together, Mr. Dickinson offered to build a fine house for his son Austin and his new bride. The house was built on the other side of the rather large piece of land he owned, and Emily walked the path between the two houses regularly to visit Susan, and vice versa. At the end of the 20th century, the scholars Martha Nell Smith and Ellen Louise Hart published the letters between the two women, written over 36 years. Often people talk about how these letters show a deeply intimate connection between the two women. That's certainly true, although exactly what deeply intimate means is not entirely clear. Susan was a great reader with a large library of her own that she and Emily often shared. Bookishness was clearly part of their friendship. Their letters show an intensity to their relationship, a passion that goes beyond just words on a page, though. There's another picture that comes out of these letters, too, that intrigues me, that Emily shared her writing with Susan. Susan was her, quote, primary reader and literary companion, as the book says. Emily sometimes wrote poems specifically for her and shared many, many more, accepting a certain amount of criticism from Susan, too. So much for the image of the reclusive spinster who told no one she wrote and squirreled all her poems away in a drawer to be found only after she died. And yet there's some truth in that story, of course. Fewer than a dozen of Emily's poems were published during her lifetime, and all were published without her permission and also completely anonymously. After she died, her sister supposedly found the enormous tranche of her letters in a drawer, and she claimed that she had no idea that Emily wrote. I find this a little unlikely. It's a long story, but Lavinia quickly tried to turn her sister into a legend, and I wonder if her supposed complete ignorance was a pretty significant exaggeration. Susan and Austin's house has not been renovated, as the Dickinson homestead has been. Instead, it has been conserved in its original state. That is, almost all of it is exactly as it was in the latter part of the 19th century. Almost nothing has been changed, except to limit any future deterioration. Some of the wallpaper has been carefully washed, but almost everything has a grayed look to it, acquired over many decades. It's laying empty. I've chosen to distinguish these two styles as renovation in the case of Emily's house and conservation or perhaps preservation in the case of Austin and Susan's house. I'm not sure that's the right lingo. From what I can tell, these words are widely used that way, but not always. There can be quite a fine line between the styles sometimes, too. I mentioned that I would circle back to why much of the furniture in Dickinson's homestead was original, despite the fact that it had been owned and inhabited by others for decades. Well, when Susan and Austin died, they left both houses to their daughter. She moved into her parents' house and, in need of funds, sold her aunt's house. But before she sold it, she moved the vast majority of its furnishings into her own house. Fascinating. Okay, after I left the Emily Dickinson Museum properties, I had the amazing opportunity to meet a wonderful booktuber who I discovered relatively recently, Rid of Rid Books. I first found her channel when she was talking about what she might purchase during the upcoming NYRB sale. We met up at a lovely little coffee shop in town, and I'm afraid it didn't even occur to me to take a picture of us together. But we talked about our experiences at the Emily Dickinson Museum, which Rid visits fairly regularly, about what we've been reading lately, and also about our families. She's roughly the age of my son, at a time in her life when she's stepping into new, mature roles. I loved hearing her stories. There is one story she told me about what her bookish channel has brought to her life that I found incredible. I'm not going to spoil it, but I do hope she'll share it at some point on her own channel. Thank you so much, Red, for joining me. Well, that evening I finished the Emily Dickinson mystery. It's basically the story of a young new maid hired to work in the Dickinson household who gets to know Emily more than she had expected she would. Within days of her arrival, her brother dies at his place of work, and Emily gets intrigued by the story, quickly realizing that the brother was almost certainly murdered. His death appeared to her to be connected with a conflict between city residents about helping people who had escaped from slavery and come north to Amherst, knowing they had to move even further north to avoid the dictates of the fugitive slave law, legislation that required even non-slave states in the U.S. to return runaways to the slave South. I am an historian of the U.S. South, especially interested in how race functioned in the pre- and post-Civil War periods, so this plot line and the mystery definitely drew me in. And in addition to my appreciation of the theme of abolitionism in the 19th century, to my surprise, the family makes a train trip between Amherst and Washington, D.C. in the novel, a parallel I wasn't expecting. I was also intrigued that the author embraced the changing understanding of Emily Dickinson. When I was growing up, the nation's cultural imagination tended to portray Dickinson as a recluse and also more or less as a timid mouse. That never quite made sense to me, given her bold and independent poems and letters. Nowadays, the understanding is quite a bit more nuanced. The guides at the museum emphasized that while the poet was a very private person in some ways, she was also intensely herself, unafraid to live as she pleased, such as not going to church with her family, and not afraid to speak her mind. She was also quite funny. The mystery novel features an Emily more in line with that spunky Emily, and yet her desire for an intense degree of privacy is missing. Perhaps that might have been true during her early years, which is when this novel is set, but she is a character, and her maid and co-investigator are profoundly modern. Instead of seeming to grow out of the 19th century, they speak like young women today might speak. And that's kind of a clash, to have a combination of a complex 19th century historical issue with such very modern cultural attitudes. Also, the mystery is pretty predictable. When we first meet the character we later hear committed the crime, it is clear that we are almost certainly looking at the murderer. So overall, while I was amused by the book, for sure, I don't highly recommend it unless you're a Dickinson fanatic desperate for a bit of light distraction. Okay, on to my final morning at Amherst. I woke up early, walked around town for a bit, and then spent some time sitting on the screened-in porch, which overlooks Emily's house. I loved listening to the birds while drinking my tea and reading a slim little book by Martha Dickinson Bianchi, Emily's niece, recounting her childhood experiences with her aunt. The text is quite sweet, but really not necessary Dickinson reading unless you're a devotee. And even if you are a devotee, I hereby give you permission to skip the ridiculous introduction written by Anthony Madrid. Afterwards, I searched online and eventually found a recording of some of the work of the 20th century composer Aaron Copland, a setting of some of Dickinson's poems, which I'll link to down below in the description box. I thought that listening to this pairing of music and literature might be a great way to prepare for the Booktube event, The Sound of May. And what an interesting pairing here. Two creators who were both connected to folk traditions in Amherst, but also deeply committed to the creation of innovative art. And while I always loved listening to Copland's music, this time my attention focused more on Dickinson's words, perhaps because of my recent adventures. I was more taken than ever with the links between Emily Dickinson and the Transcendentalist movement. Emily was not exactly a transcendentalist herself, although she was familiar with a lot of their writing and lecturing around New England. Both the work of the transcendentalist and the work of Dickinson share some roots in Romanticism, too. I'll be talking on a future video about Concord, Massachusetts, and its many transcendentalist residents, but for now, let me just say in brief that Ralph Waldo Emerson is usually seen as at the center of everything. He was well known for his essays, including one called Nature, positing that humans should have deep personal relationships with the natural world, partly because nature could give them an almost non-supernatural connection to divinity, since nature was permeated by the divine. One of the other well-known transcendentalists, Henry David Thoreau, wrote work that focused on the natural world as well, although his work was often a reshaping of Emerson's ideas. We'll talk about that more a little later. To come back to the topic of Emily Dickinson and Aaron Copland, though, one of the poems that Copland set to music, the one I listened to first, was Nature, the Gentlest Mother. Let me read a section from her poem, where she, like Emerson, ties nature to divinity, although in this case metaphorically as a woman caring for and shepherding those around her. Nature, the gentlest mother, impatient of no child, the feeblest or the waywardest, her admonition mild. In forest and the hill by traveler is heard, restraining rampant squirrel or too impetuous bird. How fair her conversation, a summer afternoon, her household, her assembly, when the sun goes down. Her voice among the aisles incites the timid prayer of the minutest cricket, the most unworthy flower. When all the children sleep, she turns as long away as will suffice to light her lamps, then bending from the sky with infinite attention and infinite care, her golden finger on her lip will silence everywhere. Okay, one final thing that I want to mention, which I felt the moment my train pulled into the local station. I was struck by how calm everything was, just in general, in small-town Massachusetts. My own regular life in the urban Washington, D.C. area always feels a bit frantic as residents rush to work and tourists swarm the city. And the last many months have been really intense here. While I love my city, I must say that the gentle days in Amherst without any of the tension of the nation's capital was really healing. That last afternoon, I hopped on a commuter bus to Boston, where my son met me at the station. And that is where we will pick up next time. Thanks for joining me for this part of my adventure. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.